So I guess the point is that there are a lot of banks out there and other types of funding sources, but they're doing drastically different things. And that's, our job to keep all that straight.
This is Tom Alston from Aero Marine Tax Professionals. We've got Sam Harris on this morning. And for those of you who have been to our webinars before, the very first thing I do is I play you a little video. And before I do that, I want to remind you, anytime you have a question, type it and get it to us so that Sam can answer it right away. Don't wait for us to create a Q&A session at the end, because it may lose its relevance. So anyway, here we go. Welcome to another Aero Marine free webinar. Let me tell you who we are. We help people who are buying aircraft, vessels, and vehicles to legally avoid the California tax. Just because you're a non-resident of California doesn't mean you're not subject to their assessment. So be smart about all of that. We do these for you because we're trying to give you free information. We do this all the time because you need it, because you've asked for it. And if you've got any subjects that you'd like us to cover that you haven't heard us cover in the past, just send me an email or send an email to Kelsey or call us at 916-691-9192 and we'll get you the information that you asked for. So in case you were wondering who that guy was that was doing that, that was me 40 pounds ago. I'm not too proud of it, right? All right, so here we go with Sam Harris, the grand poobah of all things aircraft financing. Take it away.
Hi, good morning, Tom. Thanks for the opportunity to spend a little time with you. JetLoan Capital, as you know, is an aviation loan brokerage. We're based in Stuart, Florida. We do a wide variety of aircraft financing transactions that we arrange through a network of funding sources that we have, that about 100 different banks, leasing companies, some private equity. We'll run through it on the slides, but that's who we are and what we do. I'm going to spend a few minutes going through the aircraft lending landscape right now as we see it. And we'll go through the different segments of general aviation, mid-cabin aircraft, large cabin aircraft. They're all a little bit different. So we'll give you our take on all of those things. Real quick history lesson in terms of where we are in banking today and where we used to be. So 50 years ago, there were about 14,000 U.S. banks. Because of the financial crisis, Dodd-Frank, and other things that have happened, that happened back in 2008, there was a lot of consolidation in the banking market. The 10 biggest banks have gotten very, very large. Right now, we estimate that there's about 5,000 banks still in the U.S. And compare with other countries, this is a lot of banks. There's a lot of capital in this country. We do deals outside of the U.S. Take Canada, for instance. I think they've got 3 or 4 very large banking institutions, and not a lot else to choose from. So we are unique in this country in that we have, even though we have less banks than we used to, we still have a lot of banks, a lot of capital compared to the rest of the world. So our banking market tends to be quite different than outside of the U.S. We think that there are about 1,700 U.S. banks with assets over 300 million. There are so many of these banks of relatively large size, and they're scattered all throughout the country, that a lot of these, they're not household names, but they have a lot of lending capacity. And so in today's world, there is a lot of capital out there looking to be deployed into aircraft loans. We break down the aircraft lending sources by banks, leasing companies, credit unions, and private equity funding sources. And as you might imagine, banks and credit unions have the lowest interest rates. Leasing companies tend to play in a little bit higher risk profile and rate profile. And then the private equity lenders, they're looking for the highest rate of return, and they're usually lending into a more risky or non-bank type of situation. In terms of the banks that are active in the space right now, they're focusing on different segments of the business. Some will do piston and turboprops. Some will do light and mid-sized jets. Others will concentrate specifically on large cabin. Some will do international. Some will do domestic. Some will do regional transactions inside of the U.S. So I guess the point is that there are a lot of banks out there and other types of funding sources, but they're doing drastically different things. And that's, our job to keep all that straight. Criteria that lenders look for in financing transactions. These are just some of the things that are important. The client industry, the client's geographical location. Is it a corporate entity versus a high net worth individual? The aircraft type and the aircraft age. I don't see engine program on here, but that's a big factor. Another really big factor is the aircraft going to do any charter. So all of these things affect which banks and funding sources will look at specific transactions. In other words, it has to fit their box, as we say, and these are some of the variables that affect that. I'll just run you through what we see in terms of the banks and size of banks and in terms of where they play. So on smaller transactions for pistons and turboprop type aircraft, these are mainly done by small banks and credit unions. We deal with these banks and credit unions all over the United States. They're in different areas, but the funding sources that play in this space tend to be smaller banks and credit unions. They like to do transactions as small as $50,000, and by policy, they may max out at $1 million to $1.5 million in terms of a loan amount. And because they're smaller institutions, they just can't go higher than that. What's a little bit unique about these institutions is that they will actually do loan terms from 15 to 20 years. And on a couple of the slides ahead, we'll show you how that's different with some of the commercial banks. So they'll do terms and amortizations all the way out to 20 years. Right now, typically they have fixed interest rates. I don't really see any variable in this group. And their rates right now could be in the low to middle fours to high fours. So, maybe 4 1/4 to 4 3/4. They typically will finance about 75 to 80% of the aircraft price, subject to appraisal. These lenders also tend to be very formulaic. They'll look at 2 to 3 years worth of tax returns. They want to make sure that they can easily see that the client has income flowing to their personal tax return, that they can justify the ability to amortize the aircraft loan plus the operating expenses. They're not especially good at stories and explanations. It's kind of like they want to see 2 or 3 years. If they don't see that, it's hard for them to do. The next group that we deal with are mid-sized banks, and they will tend to lend on turboprops, light jet market. You know, we'll see Mustangs, you know, Pilatuses, that kind of thing here. They like to play in the $500,000 to $5 million, you know, type of space, and they usually would be maxed out. And these aren't really hard and fast rules, and there is some overlap, but in general, this is what we see. The difference with these mid-sized banks that tend to be more commercial lenders is that they'll structure a term from 5 to 7 years with a balloon, and they'll do amortizations typically out to about 15 years. So with the small banks, they'll give you a 20-year deal. With these mid-sized banks that tend to be more commercial oriented, they will do a 5 and 7 year term to a balloon. So that's probably one of the biggest differences. Fixed interest rates right now are currently in the low to middle 4s, and if the transaction's a little bit larger, maybe above 3 or 4 million, we have seen some interest rates as low as 3.5 to 3 3/4 in that market. These lenders will finance a little bit more, you know, anywhere from probably 75 to 90%. The smaller banks typically won't go above 80 to 85, but these larger, slightly larger commercial banks, if they really like the credit, they'll lend a little bit more. The large regional and national banks are lending in the mid-cabin to large cabin space. So these are larger transactions, loan amounts from $5 to $50 million. And here again, these are the bigger banks, and they're commercial oriented. So it's the same thing with a 5 to 7 year term with a balloon, amortizations out to 15 years. If it's a brand new airplane and a large corporate credit that they really like, they might push the amortization to 20 years. Fixed interest rates can be as low as the mid-3s, up to 4%. One thing that I have been asked a lot about lately is, will these banks do interest only? You know, back in the old days before the financial crisis, you could sometimes get a loan that was interest-only payment for 2 or 3 years. We really don't see that anymore unless it's like a private banking situation where you have to put some money with the bank to be managed, but we normally don't see it. These loans are almost always amortizing. And you know, they'll go LTVs from 75 to 100%. So if it's a, you know, a ultra high net worth individual, or large corporation, if they want to finance 100% and the credit's there, these banks will do that. Aircraft age is a big factor here. These large banks, large transactions, they really want newer airplanes. And by that I mean probably newer than certainly 10 to 15 years. They like the newer assets. So here's what we see going on right now. Interest rates have decreased a little bit this year. Back several months ago when you heard talk of inverted yield curve and you know, treasury yields on the 10-year, you know, going down, that was happening in the late summer, early fall, and it's recovered a little bit, but in general interest rates are down. The big banks on the larger transactions are typically pricing over some kind of a swap rate. Those are published, like a 5-year swap. You can look that up and add a spread to it. That's how the large banks tend to quote pricing. The smaller banks they give you an interest rate. They may have a published interest rate that they're using for a period of time that they can change whenever they want to change that. So rates in general are down. We see a lot of buying activity in the GA and owner flown space, and maybe slightly less activity in large cabin. There's a lot of competition among the lenders that we work with for mid-sized jet loans right now. Some of the larger banks, mid to large banks that lend mid-sized jet, large cabin loans, they seem to be a little slower right now. But again, the GA owner flown is extremely active. I think on the large end of the spectrum, a lot of the good inventory might have been bought up, so it's a little bit harder to find a plane right now. We estimate that 50% of aircraft purchases are cash and about 50% are financed.
I find that to be true also.
Okay. Yeah, it's funny. Back in the day, before the financial crisis, I would tell you that we thought probably 3/4 of the aircraft were financed. And then after the financial crisis, first off, borrowers, if they put their money in the bank, they didn't get any interest. And secondly, their perception was to go try to borrow for anything was going to be such a painful ordeal that they really didn't want to deal with it. And then we thought that maybe 25% of the purchases were financed. Well, now that the perception is that there's more money, lending's a little easier than it was 5 years ago. More people are borrowing again, but probably not at the percentage level that they were 10 years ago. We've seen a lot of new lenders come into the space. Certainly over the last 5, 6, 7 years, probably not much happened for the first couple years after the financial crisis, 08, 09, 2010. But we saw a lot of new lenders starting to come in after that. They've been really pretty active for the last 5 years, building out some portfolios. Some of the traditional legacy lenders that were in the space no longer are. For instance, GE Capital, they were the largest aircraft lending company out there, and they no longer exist. They were purchased by Global Jet Capital. But so the landscape has really changed a lot in 7 to 8 years. New banks have come in. Some of the old banks, because of the financial crisis, had portfolio problems. They exited the space. Some of those are back. So there's been a lot of turnover. It's been really, really dynamic for the last 6, 7, 8, 10 years. So, why are lenders coming into this space? No matter what your size in terms of a bank, like we talked about earlier, there's a lot of banks in the U.S. and they're all competing for loans. A lot of them are too concentrated in real estate. One of the other things they like about aircraft loans is they come in relatively large, chunks. I mean, you take a $1 million airplane or a $5 million aircraft. Yeah, you put a loan out at that size. That's a lot easier than doing, construction and trucking, et cetera, medical equipment. Aircraft are expensive, so those dollar amounts are large, and lenders like that.
Sam, I have a question I want to ask you. I'm going to back up one line where you say many are concentrated in real estate. Do you think that portends that the banks think the real estate market is about to crash a bit?
I don't really hear that, as such, but I think, as bankers, they're always looking at their portfolio and percentages and all these other kind of things. And, there's just been a lot of real estate activity in the last 5, 6, 7 years. You look around. I was just in Nashville yesterday. There's cranes up everywhere downtown. I even noticed, Las Vegas, there was a lot of building going on out there. Well, 10 years ago, everything really kind of stopped. But, in the last 7 or 8 years, There's a lot of building going on. There's a lot of real estate lending happening. Where I am in Florida, home prices have recovered. They went down after the financial crisis, but they're back to, levels, from 2006 or 7 or whatever before things. So there's just a lot of lending activity. And I don't know that anybody thinks that some people think that there, could be whatever, is going to happen. But I don't really hear that they're concerned about it, other than it's just as a percentage, it's become a large percentage.
Got it.
And so they're all under, they're under pressure to grow assets. There's a lot of capital out there. So most of these places have a lot of capital, and some of these banks, rather than borrowing from the Fed, they have a lot of deposits, and they need, they're a bank. I mean, their job is to lend those deposits out. That's how they make money. And so, all these factors are contributing to more lenders coming into this space.
Okay, thank you for that question.
Yeah, sure. No, thank you. And the other factor was that, a lot of banks like to lend to aircraft owners because they're relatively affluent, and it leads to other business, banking opportunity, wealth management, etc. Other things the banks can do with these people. These are people that they want in their portfolio. I'm going to run you through our financing checklist just real quickly, but it identifies some of the factors that determine which lenders will be interested in a specific transaction. I'm not going to worry about the first few very obvious ones, but let's start with the aircraft. So the type of aircraft is going to greatly influence which banks will be interested in the transaction. Again, the purchase price. Some of the small banks can't do anything over $1 million, so the purchase price is a big factor, as is the requested finance amount. And then some of these other things play a big part as well, like where's the aircraft going to be domiciled? Is it Part 91 or Part 135 usage? The Part 135 usage is a very big factor, and if it's going to be predominantly a 135 airplane, most banks won't lend into that situation. We've done transactions with leasing companies that are more comfortable with that model, and a handful of banks, but primarily what the banks want to see is mostly a Part 91 type aircraft. Estimated flight hours it's a big factor. Engine maintenance plan is a huge factor, as is aircraft age. For instance, older aircraft are harder to finance because a lot of these banks have policies where they won't do an aircraft that's older than 15 or 20 years, for instance. And we have plenty of other lenders that will. But a really difficult scenario to get financed is an older airplane that's not on an engine maintenance program, and it's going to do a lot of charter. There are very, very few lenders that want to lend into that scenario. So those are the primary factors that affect which lenders are going to participate. The rest of this is really just a checklist of information that we'll typically gather in order to give a customer some indicative terms. A little commercial for us. Why is it important to use an aircraft loan broker? We are reviewing the capital markets on a daily basis. This is all we do. We probably work with over 100 diversified funding sources. Again, banks, credit unions, leasing companies, U.S.-based banks, foreign banks. It really runs the gamut. We find that especially on older aircraft, especially older jets, some of the big lenders in the space aren't doing those. We have a lot of good funding sources for slightly older planes. And we have 30 years worth of experience in this space, so typically we can make it a more efficient process.
I want to back up to the last slide a second and ask a question.
Sure.
When I look at your experience with and using all these diversified funding sources, is there an area, type of aircraft, age of aircraft that currently isn't being serviced very well or at all by these funding sources that you have?
Well, if you go back to the older aircraft, you've got a 1995 Falcon or Gulfstream or something like this, a large cabin older airplane. There are not a lot of banks that want to lend on that on a percentage basis, but I'll tell you that we probably have 5, 6, 7 that will. But older large cabin airplanes are a little more difficult to finance. And again, if they're not on an engine program and or they're going to run charter, you start to put all those things together, and it's the number of lenders that's out there, it becomes a very small group, the lenders that will finance into that scenario.
So if I was to repeat your answer to you, there isn't a type of aircraft or age of aircraft that's not being serviced, it's just less choices.
Yeah, I think that's true. Again, there's so much capital out there. There are so many banks out there that typically, in almost any situation, there's going to be a solution, typically.
Perfect. One thing I need to remind the audience, which I have not since the beginning, is that you have an opportunity to talk to a finance guy who's going to give you answers to your specific questions in this marketplace. Sam has made his time available to you. Reach out to him with whatever questions you've got.
Yeah, happy to take questions. This is really just a quick recap. So there's a lot of lenders in the space. That means there's a lot of competition for loans. It's a good time to be a borrower. And again, there's a wide range of financing available for almost any aircraft type. You just talked about this. The landscape it's very dynamic. It's changing constantly with banks coming in and out of the space. Banks, they're purchased. Management teams change, and then in terms of what they want to do or not do with aviation, that tends to change quite a bit too. Loan terms are going to vary greatly from bank to bank, and right now we're seeing that the purchasing and lending activity is very strong. And of course, we hope that continues.
Yes.
I'll add one thing.
Go ahead.
With the tax law that went into effect a couple of years ago, with being able to, and I know that this is your area, not mine, and I know that there's a lot of things that affect this, but being able to write that aircraft off more quickly or all at once when you buy it, that's a big factor, and that's motivating a lot of people, especially to do transactions between now and the end of the year.
I agree with that completely, because I remember when they first passed that law, a lot of people were telling me, well, that's going to kill the spike in sales at the end of the year. I said, if you think that, you don't know American taxpayers who are aircraft owners very well at all, because even though they took away the 1031 exchange, that accelerated depreciation, and accelerated means you wrote off 100% of it in the first year, is always been a reason in people's minds to buy aircraft. And for me, it doesn't matter whether the guy's buying a $200,000 or a $100 million airplane. They have the same types of motivations, and I like the fact that you tell me that lenders are fighting to get into the space, because that indicates they're positive about the aviation industry going forward. And it's certainly, with the long-term nature of loans, they're they're very, very positive that it's going to continue. And I like to hear all that. I like it to be positive.
Yeah, it's, I feel like it's a really good time to be in the business. It's fun. There's a lot of, there's a lot happening. So that keeps it interesting.
Great. Now, if there's no more questions, please put your contact information up there so people can figure out how to get in touch with you, either phone number or email. You had a slide earlier.
Oh, I have to go back
to the first one.
There we go.
There you go.
Yeah, I'm happy to, we're always happy to, call us with a what if, and we can run payment schedules, amortizations based on specifics. We do that all the time. We're happy to do it.
Awesome. Well, if there's no more questions, we're here for you, and don't waste this opportunity. But there's Sam's contact information, both his email, his phone number, and his website. You should know mine if you're on our list, but you can always call me. I'm at 916-691-9192. And if you need both California sales tax service, which it doesn't require that you be a California resident, California can come after you for any reason. If your airplane is inside California at any time, even once, within 12 months of your purchase date, and they find you, they can send you an assessment letter. Once they send you an assessment letter, you have to file a tax return to support that you don't owe it. So that's all the scary stuff I can say. Thank you for your time, Sam. I'm glad to hear that you were as positive about what happened at NBAA. It was the best NBAA show that I've ever been to. And I met a lot of great people, and there's a lot of enthusiasm going forward and a lot of airplane sales still happening. So don't be afraid.
Yeah, I think I've been for the last 25 years. I think I missed one in that period of time. And I would say that it was, if it wasn't the best show that I've been at, it's one of the best. I was talking to banks and customers and people in the industry that, they were doing transactions at the show. There were customers there. So I'd say the feeling was very upbeat.
Okay. And you might have heard very early when I first came on that I talked about the possibility that NBAA is not going back to Las Vegas for a couple of years. That's not a decision that they made on their own. What's going on is that the CES show, which occurs at Las Vegas every year, becomes so big, they're building a brand new main hall, and the current places, the two halls, the Central Hall and the South Hall and the North Hall, are all going to become auxiliary halls. So they're planning on that show venue expanding a lot, and we'd love to see you there. And if you have any questions about loans, you call Sam. If you have any questions about taxes, whether they're California taxes or not, even though I am only an expert in California sales and use tax, I know most of the experts in this country, and I'll get you the answer to your questions. Anyway, Sam, thanks for coming on as usual.
Okay.
A great presentation. Thanks for the update of what's going on, and I'm signing off.
Okay. Thanks, Tom.
Bye.
Bye-bye.